Think about the last time you had nothing to do. Not the kind of nothing that's actually a quiet Tuesday morning with your phone in your hand. Real nothing. No deliverables, no inbox, no ambient sense that you should be doing something. The rare, almost terrifying kind of stillness where the day simply stretches in front of you with no particular shape. Most of us don't last long in that state before we fill it. We check something, we start something, we feel guilty if we don't. Now imagine that state lasting 4 months. That was winter in medieval Europe. The harvest was done, the fields were frozen, the sun set at 4 in the afternoon and didn't rise again until 8 the next morning, and for roughly a third of every year, across every village, farm, and hamlet on the continent, the question hanging in the cold air was the same. What exactly are you supposed to do now? The answer historians have assumed for centuries is pretty bleak, that people simply endured, that they huddled, starved slowly, and waited for spring with gritted teeth, that winter was a kind of death that people merely survived. But that assumption is wrong, and the truth of what medieval people actually did during those long, dark months reveals something uncomfortable about the life we've built for ourselves today. The real answer is stranger than you think. Most people, when they picture a medieval peasant in winter, picture something close to hibernation. The harvest is over, the cold has come, and there is simply nothing to do. So people went inside, pulled on whatever animal skins they had, and waited. They ate whatever they'd managed to store, tried not to freeze, and emerged blinking into March like people coming up for air. That picture isn't entirely wrong. Winter was brutal. Disease was rampant. Food was scarce by February. People died. The Little Ice Age, which gripped Europe roughly between the 13th and 19th centuries, made conditions significantly worse than the relatively mild winters of the early medieval period. But survival mode assumes that medieval people had no interior life, no social structure, and no deliberate relationship with the season. It frames winter as a pause, a gap between the real parts of life. That's not quite right, because medieval people didn't treat winter as a problem to outlast. They treated it as a different kind of time, and they built an entire culture around it, one that was, by some measures, surprisingly rich. Here's what actually happened when winter came. First, the slaughter. Before the first hard freeze, farmers killed most of their livestock. Not out of despair, out of strategy. You couldn't feed cattle through 4 months of snow, so you didn't try. What you could do was salt the meat, smoke it, hang it from the rafters, and pack it in fat. This single act, what we now call charcuterie, was the cornerstone of winter survival. The medieval peasant wasn't waiting out winter. They were living inside a decision they'd made in October. Then the indoor work began, and there was more of it than you'd expect. The fields weren't completely abandoned. Medieval agricultural records from the manor of Cuxham in Oxfordshire, England, showed that peasants planted winter crops, primarily wheat, in the early cold months, so they would germinate before the ground froze hard and spring forward when it thawed. The fields needed tending even in winter. Fences needed mending. Tools needed repair. Animals still had to be fed and cared for. The pace slowed, but it didn't stop. And in the evenings, those long, dark, 16-hour evenings, something else happened. People talked. Historian L. Johnson, who holds 2 master's degrees in medieval life and has spent years reconstructing the texture of ordinary existence in pre-modern Europe, describes winter as a time of deliberate communal gathering. Villages came together in ways they simply couldn't during the labor-intensive summer months. Stories were told, games were played, weaving and spinning occupied the hands, while voices filled the room. What Johnson calls seasonal living wasn't just practical, it was intentional. Entire communities slowed down together in a way that research on social bonding now tells us is deeply restorative. Medieval calendars from the period, illuminated manuscripts depicting month-by-month life, showed January as a month of feasting, fires, and people warming warming themselves in close domestic spaces. The Très riche Heure de Duc de Berry, the extraordinary Book of Hours, commissioned around 1411 by Jean, Duke of Berry, and painted by the Limburg brothers between 1412 and 1416, contains one of the most detailed visual records we have of medieval life. Its February calendar page depicts a snow-covered farmstead, sheep huddled in a pen, a beehive buried in white, and inside the cottage, figures warming themselves by an open fire with their skirts and tunics raised, a detail so candid it feels almost modern. These people weren't enduring, they were comfortable, but that's only half the story. In 2001, a historian named A. Roger Ekirch at Virginia Tech published a paper in the American Historical Review that upended everything we thought we understood about pre-modern life, not just winter, but every single night of every season that came before the Industrial Revolution. The paper was called "Sleep We Have Lost: Pre-Industrial Slumber in the British Isles," and what Ekirch had found, buried in 15 years of digging through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literary sources from across medieval and early modern Europe, was this: people did not sleep the way we sleep. They slept in two phases. A first sleep began shortly after dark, around 7 or 8 in the evening, and lasted roughly midnight. Then people woke up for an hour, sometimes 2, and they were awake in the middle of the night, in the dark, doing things, praying, talking quietly to a spouse, having sex, reflecting on their dreams, visiting a neighbor. Then they slept again, a second sleep, until dawn. Ekirch published a follow-up study in the journal Sleep in 2016, Segmented Sleep in Pre-Industrial Societies, confirming the pattern across multiple cultures. Historian Craig Koslowski at the University of Illinois described this wakeful period as a demarcated period of nocturnal activity in the middle of long nights. Not an accident, not insomnia, but a normal feature of human existence before artificial light restructured the dark. Think about what this means for a medieval winter. With 16 hours of darkness every night, peasants weren't unconscious through all of it. They were awake, quietly, contemplatively awake, in a way that modern life has completely abolished. The very thing we gained, the ability to push light and productivity through every hour of every night, is the same thing that erased a form of consciousness our ancestors considered ordinary. We don't have a word for what they experienced in that in-between hour because we no longer experience it. We've engineered it out of existence. Here's what makes this personal. We live in a culture with a word for doing nothing, wasting time. The assumption embedded in modern life is that rest is a recovery tool, something you do so you can go back to being productive. Sleep is optimized. Downtime is scheduled. Even leisure has deliverables. Medieval people didn't think that way. They couldn't afford to, in the most literal sense. Winter forced them into a different relationship with time, and they built their culture around it, rather than against it. Feasts and festivals broke the monotony. Market days created social rhythm. The church calendar, Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, gave the dark months shape and meaning. These weren't just religious obligations, they were psychological infrastructure. Compare this to modern January, and the contrast is almost painful. Rates of depression and anxiety spike in the winter months across industrialized nations. We fight the season with bright lights, productivity hacks, and the moral pressure to treat January as a fresh start rather than a natural slowdown. We have built a civilization designed to make winter irrelevant, and in doing so, we may have lost something we don't even have a name for anymore. L. Johnson put it plainly in a 2025 interview, in terms of well-being, medieval winter living may have been better for ordinary people's mental health, not despite the darkness, but because of it. Because humans, she argues, are simply meant to slow down in winter. We're fighting a rhythm that is older than agriculture. There's a painting in the Musée Condé in Chantilly, France, February, from the Très Riche Oeuvre de Duc de Berry, c. 1412. Snow is falling. A cart sits frozen in the yard. The birds are on the bare trees, and inside a small wooden cottage, 3 figures are pressed close to a fire, lifting their clothes toward the heat, faces slack with something that isn't misery. It looks, if you let it, a little bit like peace. We look at images like this and we feel pity. Primitive conditions, short lives, no antibiotics, no central heating, no Netflix. But those figures in the firelight weren't checking whether they should be doing something else. They weren't anxious about what January was supposed to mean for their personal growth. They were just there, inside winter, with each other, in the dark, awake between their first sleep and their second sleep, or maybe already drifting. And maybe the question isn't what they did all winter. Maybe the question is what we've done with all the light. We filled it, every hour of it, and the thing we filled it with, that restless, connected, productive, anxious, always-onness, it has a cost we're only beginning to measure. Medieval people didn't conquer winter, they inhabited it. We conquered it, and we're not sure anymore what we got in return.